She did not scream. She did not run. When 600 pounds of black muscle and blind fury came barreling down the frozen main street of Millhaven, Montana, Nora Bassett planted her feet in the mud, spread her arms wide bassin, and stood her ground while every man within sight dove for cover. The horse was called Hellfire. He had broken bones, ended careers, and made grown wranglers weep, and he stopped, trembling, snorting, his nose inches from her chest. But that was midday. This story begins in the morning. The stagecoach from Billings arrived 40 minutes late on a Tuesday in January 1884, and the whole town of Millhaven already knew it before the wheels stopped rolling. Word moved faster than horses in a town this size. The word that afternoon had passed from the telegraph office to the feed store to the saloon in less time than it took a man to finish his coffee. Colt Hargrove's mail-order bride had finally arrived, and she was a large woman. That was the word they used. Not sturdy, not full-figured, not a woman of generous proportions the way a polite man might phrase it in a letter. Large. The stagecoach driver had stopped at Caldwell Station 2 hours east, and by the time he had helped her down from the coach and back up again, half the riders had already spread the news ahead of him like fire chasing dry grass. So when the coach finally rolled to a stop in front of Alderman's General Store, there was already a crowd. Not a welcoming crowd, the sort that gathers when a town expects a show. Nora Bassett felt them before she saw them. She felt the weight of their attention through the thin walls of the coach, the way you feel a cold wind before a door opens all the way. She had felt that kind of attention before. Her whole life had been shaped under it, worn smooth in some places and raw in others by the constant grinding pressure of being looked at and found wanting. She was 32 years old. She had a practical mind, a strong back, and hands that had been calloused since she was 14 from every kind of work Ohio had asked of her. She was tall. She was broad across the shoulders and broader still through the middle, built in the way of certain women who come from farming families and cold winters and the particular kind of life that does not ask whether you are comfortable before it asks what you can do. She smoothed the front of her traveling dress. Dark blue wool, the best she owned. The hem was muddy from the stop in Caldwell. There was a small tear near the left sleeve where the door latch had caught it. She had nothing to replace it with. This was the dress she arrived in, and it would have to be enough. She gathered her traveling bag. She picked up the small bundle of dried lavender she had brought from her mother's garden in Columbus, her one indulgence, her one piece of home. She tucked it into her coat pocket, then she pushed open the coach door and stepped out into Montana. The cold hit her like something personal. January in Millhaven was not the polite winter she had known in Ohio. It was hostile and deliberate, cold that found the gaps in your coat and settled in your lungs like it intended to stay. She breathed it in. She steadied herself on the step. Then she climbed down. She heard the laughter before both feet touched the ground. It started low, the way laughter always starts when it is trying to disguise itself as something else. A cough, a murmur, and then a boy. He could not have been more than 12, standing near the post rail with 3 friends, said it loud enough for the whole street to hear. Lord Almighty, Hargrove sent for a whole woman, didn't he? The laughter spread like spilled water. Nora stood in the street and let it come. She had learned a long time ago that flinching only fed it, that looking away gave people permission to go further. So she stood with her traveling bag in one hand and her spine as straight as she could hold it, and she looked at the boy who had spoken, and she waited. He stopped laughing first. Good, she thought. A man stepped forward from the crowd, wide shoulders, work-scarred hands, a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same stone as the mountains behind him. He held his hat in both hands, and his eyes moved over her once, just once, with an expression she could not quite read, not cruelty, not welcome either. Something careful, something reserved. "Mrs. Bassett," he said. His voice was lower than she had expected, steady, like a man who chose his words the way other men chose their tools, for purpose, not decoration. "Mr. Hargrove," she said. She had practiced saying his name in the coach. She had practiced the whole conversation, actually, the way she always did when she was walking into something that frightened her. She had imagined a dozen versions of this meeting. A kind man, a cold man, a man who looked at her and immediately regretted the letters they had exchanged. What she had not imagined was the way his eyes stayed on her face, not on her body, not on the mud on her hem or the tear in her sleeve, on her face. "You had a long ride," he said. "I did. You hungry I could eat?" Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. "Good," he said. "The cook has been nervous about impressing you all week. I would hate for his effort to go to waste." She did not know what to do with that. She nodded. He reached for her bag. She held it a half-second longer than necessary. Old habit, old lesson. Then she let him take it. "My horse is at the rail," he said, turning toward the hitching post. "The wagon is around back." The screaming started before he finished the sentence. Not human screaming. The high, tearing sound of a horse in pure terror and fury. A sound that reached inside your chest and squeezed. The stock pen at the far end of the street, a reinforced enclosure of heavy timber and iron bolts that Nora had barely registered when she stepped off the coach, exploded outward like it was made of paper. Black! That was all she saw at first. A wall of black moving faster than something that size had any right to move. Mane like smoke. Eyes white-rimmed and wild. Hooves throwing frozen mud in sheets as he hit the open street at full gallop. The crowd scattered like startled birds. Men dove behind barrels, behind wagons, behind each other. Women grabbed children and pressed into doorways. The boy who had laughed at Nora hit the ground flat on his stomach and covered his head with his arms. Colt Hargrove spun and shouted something. A name, maybe, a command, but the horse was not listening to anyone. It was not capable of listening. Whatever was inside that animal in that moment was not thought or training or response. It was pure, undiluted terror dressed up as rage. Nora saw the child. A little girl, 4 years old, maybe 5. She had been standing near the water trough with a rag doll tucked under her arm. In the chaos of the crowd scattering, she had been left behind. She stood in the middle of the street, absolutely frozen, staring at the horse coming toward her with the wide, uncomprehending eyes of someone too young to understand that they were about to be killed. Nora was not fast. She had never been fast. Her body moved the way it had always moved, with effort, with deliberateness, with a kind of momentum that required more intention than most people gave to motion. She could not sprint. She could not throw herself across the street in 2 steps the way a lighter woman might, but she was already moving. She dropped her bag. Her hand found a flour sack that had been knocked off a cart in the chaos. Heavy, 50 pounds at least, white with dust. She grabbed it by the neck and she walked straight down the center of that frozen mud street toward the horse, toward the child. Nora. Colt's voice, sharp and close. "Get back!" She did not get back. Later, she would not be able to fully explain what she did next, because there was no technique to it, no training, no system she had learned from a book or a teacher. It was something older than technique, something she had spent her entire life learning without knowing she was learning it. She put herself between the child and the horse. She planted her feet wide and solid, the way she had learned to stand when she did not want to be moved. She let the flour sack fall from her hands, and she dropped her eyes. Not down, not the shrinking that other people had spent 32 years trying to teach her. She dropped her gaze the way her grandmother had once told her that animals understood, soft, sideways, not a challenge and not a surrender, just present, just here, just a creature standing in the cold who meant no harm. The horse was 30 feet away when she did it. 20, 10. She heard the crowd behind her making sounds she could not name. Not screaming, exactly. More like the sound of a group of people who have all stopped breathing at the same moment. She heard Colt's boots on the frozen ground behind her. She heard a word she could not make out that sounded like a prayer or a curse or both. She did not look up. The horse stopped. Not gradually, not slowing over distance the way a controlled animal slows. He stopped like a wall had appeared in front of him. Haunches dropping, all 4 hooves gouging furrows in the mud, and the wave of his stopping rolled forward and hit her like wind, like heat, like the pressure of something enormous choosing at the last possible second not to destroy. She felt his breath on her face before she heard him. Hot, ragged, trembling. She smelled him, sweat and fear and something wilder underneath, something that had never been fully domesticated and perhaps never would be. His nose was 6 inches from her forehead. She still did not look up. Easy, she said. Quiet, no louder than she would have spoken to a frightened child. Easy. Nobody is going to hurt you. The horse's breathing was enormous and loud and shook through the whole street like a second heartbeat. Easy, she said again. Then she reached behind her without looking, and her hand found the little girl's shoulder, and she walked her backward. 3 steps, 4, until she felt another pair of hands, a woman's hands, desperate and shaking. Take the child away. Only then did she step back herself. 1 step, 2. Slow. The horse stood in the street and watched her go. Millhaven was silent, not the silence of a crowd holding its breath, which has a particular pressurized quality to it. This was different. This was the silence of people who had expected one thing and been given something else entirely, and had not yet found the language for what they had seen. Colt Hargrove had stopped 6 feet behind her. She could feel him there without turning around. That said, a man's voice from somewhere in the crowd, rough and uncertain, was either the bravest thing I ever saw or the stupidest. A woman's voice cut back sharp as a slap. Hush up, Gerald. Nora turned. Colt was looking at her. His hat was still in his hand from when he had taken it off to greet her, and he had not put it back on. There was something in his face she did not know what to do with. It was not the look she had received from men her whole life, not the assessment, not the visible arithmetic of her being found insufficient. It was not pity either. She had gotten very good at recognizing pity. This was something closer to recognition. Like he had looked at her and seen something he had been wondering about. That horse, she said before he could speak. What is his name? Colt blinked. Hellfire. Who named him? That I did. About a year ago when we brought him in from a cavalry auction. A pause. He had already killed a man by then. What did they do to him? She said. Before you got him. Something shifted in Colt's expression. What makes you think anyone did anything to him? Because a mean horse does not look like that, she said. A mean horse has dead eyes. That horse has terrified eyes. There is a difference. Nobody said anything. The horse in the street behind her let out a long, shuddering breath and dropped his head. Colt put his hat back on. Let us get you some food, he said. We can talk about Hellfire later. I would like that. The food or the talking both, she said. He almost smiled again. She was starting to think that was the most she was going to get out of him. And she found, to her surprise, that she did not mind. Hargrove Ranch was 4 miles outside of town. And the wagon ride there was quiet in the way that shared silences sometimes are. Not uncomfortable exactly, but full of things that had not been said yet, and both of them knew it. The mountains were violet and white in the fading afternoon light. The road was frozen solid under the wheels. Nora sat beside Colt on the wagon bench with her traveling bag at her feet, and her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on the road ahead. The letter had taken 6 weeks to reach her in Columbus. Colt Hargrove, widower, rancher, Montana Territory. Looking for a capable woman. It had said, not a pretty one, not a young one, a capable one. Those were the words that had made her sit down at her kitchen table and read the letter 3 times. Because she had never once in her life been described as capable in an advertisement for a husband. She had been married once before, a man named William Bassett, who had been kind to her for approximately 4 months and relentlessly disappointed in her for the 8 years after that. Not violent. She would always say that when she thought about it. Not violent, as if that were a bar worth clearing, but relentless in his corrections. Relentless in the cruelty of a man who had wanted one kind of wife and received another and could never quite forgive her for it. William had died of fever 2 winters ago. She had grieved him the way you grieve something that has been damaging you for years, with a complicated mixture of sorrow and relief that she suspected would never fully untangle itself. She had been alone since then, and capable. That much she knew. "How many hands do you run?" she asked. Colt glanced at her. 8, 9 in summer. You know cattle ranching. My father ran a farm. I did not grow up soft. I did not figure you did. A pause. The letters you wrote. You mentioned nursing your first husband through 2 hard winters. He was sick often. That is useful out here. Last winter we lost 2 calves and nearly lost a man because we did not know enough about treating a fever. He kept his eyes on the road. I am not looking for an ornament. Mrs. Bassett, I told you that in the letter. You did. I mean it. I know you mean it. She looked back at the road. That is why I came. The ranch appeared as the last light left the sky, a cluster of buildings around a central yard. Firelight in the windows of the main house, smoke from the cook's chimney already promising something warm. It was not a grand ranch, it was a working ranch. She could see the difference and appreciated it. Set apart from the other buildings, with a barrier of thick timber posts between it and everything else, was a separate corral. Even from this distance, in this fading light, she could hear the animal inside it, pacing, slow and heavy. He has been like that since we got him, Colt said, following her gaze. Will not settle. Cannot be ridden. Can barely be approached. He pulled the wagon to a stop near the main house and set the brake. The men want me to put him down, and you do not want to. He was quiet a moment. I paid $400 for him at the auction. I would like to get something back. She looked at him. Is that the only reason? Another pause. Longer. No, he said. That is not the only reason. She nodded. Inside the main house, the cook, a small and nervous man named Hobie, who moved around the kitchen as if he expected at any moment to be criticized, had laid out a meal that was clearly his best effort. Salt pork, boiled potatoes, cornbread, a jar of honey, a pot of coffee that smelled strong enough to stand on its own. He stood near the stove and watched her sit down with an expression of barely concealed anxiety. This looks wonderful, she said. Hobie blinked. The cornbread, ma'am. That is buttermilk. My grandmother made it the same way. She broke off a piece and ate it and let out a long, genuine breath. It is good. Really good. Hobie's face did something complicated. Then he turned back to the stove so she could not see it. She was halfway through dinner when the hands came in. There were 5 of them that evening, and she felt the change in the room the moment they entered, the drop in temperature that had nothing to do with the cold air they brought with them. They filed in quietly, too quietly, with the deliberate silence of men who were being careful. They took their seats. They helped themselves to food. They did not introduce themselves. It was the man at the far end of the table who spoke first, big across the shoulders, a nose that had been broken at least twice, a jaw that suggested he had been the one doing the breaking. He was eating without looking up, and when he spoke to his plate. "Heard you made quite an entrance in town." Nora set down her fork. "I stepped off a stagecoach." That all. He looked up. His eyes were flat and assessing and not at all friendly. "Way, I heard it. You stepped in front of Hellfire." "I did. Fool thing to do," he said. Then he said it again, slower. "Fool thing to do." "Wade." Colt's voice from the head of the table, quiet and final. "The man. Wade Pruitt." She filed the name away because she always filed away the names of people who intended to make her life difficult. Looked at Colt for a moment, then back at his plate, then he went back to eating. The rest of dinner was silent. She did not sleep well that first night, but she had not expected to. The room Colt had prepared for her was small and clean, with a quilt on the bed that had been made by someone who loved the person they were making it for. Intricate and careful and warm. She lay under it in the dark and listened to the wind off the mountains and the distant restless sound of Hellfire pacing in his corral. She thought about what Wade Pruitt's eyes had looked like when they found her at the dinner table. She had seen that look before. She knew exactly what it meant. It meant you do not belong here, and I intend to be the one who proves it. She had spent her whole life being told, in one way or another, that she did not belong, in her marriage, in her neighborhood, in every room she had ever walked into, where a different kind of woman had been expected and she had arrived instead. She had been told it so many times and in so many ways that some mornings she woke up and the first thing she felt, before she was fully awake, was the familiar weight of not being enough. But she was here. She had gotten on that stagecoach. She had ridden 6 days across 3 territories with a tear in her sleeve and mud on her hem. She had arrived in this town, and she had stood in the middle of that street when everyone else ran, and the horse had stopped. She pressed her fingers to the lavender in her coat pocket, hanging on the bedpost, in the corral. Hellfire paced. She believed that fear could be carved so deep into a living thing that it started to look like aggression from the outside, that most people seeing the aggression never stopped to ask what lay beneath it. She believed it not because she had studied horses, but because she knew it the way you know things you have lived through rather than read about. In the morning, she rose before the sun. She dressed in her warmest things. She did not ask permission. She walked out across the frozen yard in the gray pre-dawn dark, her breath making small clouds in the still air, and she stopped 10 feet from Hellfire's corral and leaned against the fence post and said nothing at all. The horse was at the far end of the enclosure. He had heard her coming. She knew because his head had come up sharp and his body had gone rigid, but he had not charged the fence. She considered that encouraging. "I am not here to do anything," she said to the dark and the horse and the empty morning. "I just wanted to be near something that understands what it feels like." Hellfire shifted his weight. He did not come closer, but he did not retreat either. She pulled the lavender from her pocket and held it in her open palm toward the fence, not reaching, not pushing, just offering. The way you offer something to a creature that does not trust you yet, knowing it might not take it today or tomorrow or for a long time, but holding out your hand anyway because that is what it means to mean it. She heard boots behind her. "You are up early," said Colt's voice. She did not turn around. "I always have been." He came up beside her and looked at the horse. For a while, neither of them said anything. He was a cavalry horse, Colt said finally. Taken wild, trained hard, used harder. When the army was done with him, they sold him at auction to a man in Billings who thought he could break what the army could not. Man put him in a round pen and went at him for 2 days straight. His voice was even, but not unaffected. Horse came out of that pen different than he went in. Nora's hand tightened around the lavender. Who bought him after that? I did. A pause. I saw him at the auction, and I thought there was something still worth saving in him. Something they had not reached yet. He shook his head. Maybe I was wrong. You were not wrong, she said. He looked at her. The thing they could not reach, she said. That is not a flaw in him. That is his survival. She finally turned her head and met his eyes. You do not fix that kind of damage by going harder at it. You fix it, if it can be fixed, by going slower than feels possible, by proving over and over again that your hands do not mean pain. Colt was quiet for a long moment. I reckon that is the most words you have said to me at once. I reckon it is. He looked back at the horse. What do you want to do? I want to stand out here in the mornings, she said. Before the men are up. I am not going to go in. I am not going to touch him. I just want to be a presence he can predict. That could take weeks. I know. It might not work. I know that too. She slipped the lavender back into her pocket. But right now, what is the alternative? He pressed his mouth into a line. The men want me to put him down, he said. Silas says it every morning. She said nothing to that. Not yet. Breakfast at 6, he said finally. Mrs. Bassett, I will be there. He turned back toward the house, and she stood at the fence a while longer. The sky was beginning to lighten, the mountains going from black to gray to the first thin edge of gold. Hellfire had not moved closer, but he was watching her. She could see the dark gleam of his eye from across the corral, steady and weary, and underneath the weariness, something she could only call tired. The exhaustion of defending yourself against a world that has decided before you open your mouth what you are and what you are worth. I will be back tomorrow, she told him, and the day after that. The horse's ear turned very slightly toward her voice. She took it as a beginning. By the end of her first week at Hargrove Ranch, Nora had cataloged the following things about her situation. The root cellar needed better organization, or they would lose a third of the winter stores to rot. Hobie had a gift for baking that he had never been encouraged to develop. 3 of the hands were watchful, but not unfriendly. 1 was indifferent, and Wade Pruitt was waiting for her to fail. She could feel his waiting, the way you feel weather coming. The quality of attention he paid her was not the attention of a man who disliked her personally. It was the attention of a man who disliked what she represented, a challenge to an order he had spent years perfecting. He had been Colt Hargrove's head hand for 4 years. She had learned that from the young wrangler named Emmett, who was 17 and gap-toothed and had the charming quality of being unable to keep a secret for more than 20 minutes. Wade runs this place, ma'am. Emmett had told her on the 3rd day while she was reorganizing the root cellar. Mister, Hargrove owns it, but Wade runs it. If you understand the difference, I understand the difference, she had said. He don't. Emmett had stopped himself. He does not like you, she had said pleasantly, the way you state a simple fact. Emmett had looked at his boots. He don't think, he says, a woman like you. That is, he says ranch work ain't. He thinks I cannot do it. Yes, ma'am. And what do you think? Emmett. The boy had looked up at that, surprised to be asked. He had thought about it with the genuine, unpretentious consideration of someone who had not yet learned that opinions were meant to be strategic. I think, he said slowly, that you stood in front of Hellfire and did not die, so you have already done something Wade cannot say he did. She had smiled at that. Go put the ledger on the table. I will go through it after lunch. Each morning before the sun came up, she walked to the corral. She never brought anything dramatic. No apples, no rope, no strategy. Just herself leaning on the post, quiet and present. She talked sometimes about Ohio, about her mother's kitchen, about the way winter light looked different in Montana than anywhere she had been before. Sharper somehow, like it was trying to cut something. By the 5th morning, Hellfire had moved to the near end of the corral. Not close enough to touch or anywhere near it, but closer. And his eyes, when they found her in the gray morning light, had something different in them. Not yet trust, which was a thing earned across much more time than 5 mornings, but the preliminary to trust, the state of no longer being certain that this was something to run from. She told no one. On the 7th morning, she found the whip. It was tucked behind a post at the corner of the corral, a short-handled driving whip, the kind used in round pen work. It had not been there the morning before. She stood and looked at it for a long moment. Then she picked it up and turned it over in her hands. Then she looked at Hellfire. The horse was pressed to the far end of the corral. His breathing was labored. His eyes were white-rimmed. Someone had used this whip on him, recently, last night maybe, or early this morning before she had arrived. The fury that moved through her was cold and quiet and complete. She had felt anger like this before. The specific purifying rage of watching something that cannot defend itself be hurt by something that should have known better. She set the whip against the fence post very carefully so it did not make noise. She did not want Hellfire to hear it fall. "I see it," she said softly to the horse. "I see what they did." Hellfire trembled. "They do not get to keep doing it," she said. "Not while I am here." She stood at the fence for the full hour. She did not move and she did not look away. And by the end, the horse had moved 6 inches closer to her end of the corral. 6 inches, after someone had undone a week of work with a whip in the dark. She thought about the patience it required. She thought about how much easier it was to destroy trust than to build it. She thought about Wade Pruitt and his flat, assessing eyes. Then she went inside and fed the whip into the iron stove piece by piece while Hobie stirred the breakfast oats with his back turned. "You did not see that," she told him. Hobie did not look up. "See what, ma'am?" Good man, she thought. She was at the breakfast table when Wade came in. He moved through the kitchen the way he always did, like a man who had decided some time ago that the space belonged to him and had never been corrected on it. He helped himself to coffee without looking at her. He sat at his end of the table and said to nobody in particular that the horse had been worked up the night before. One of the younger hands had gotten too close to the corral after supper. He said it the way men say things they want you to respond to, flatly and sideways, not looking at you, so they can claim they were not directing it at you if the response goes wrong. Nora ate her oatmeal. "You hear me, Mrs. Bassett, I heard you. Mr. Pruitt. Just letting you know your project got set back some." She set down her spoon. She looked at him with the steadiness of a woman who has been in rooms with difficult men for 32 years and has learned which battles to fight out loud and which to fight in silence. "Thank you for the update," she said. His eyes narrowed slightly. He had expected something else. Argument, maybe, or distress. He was not sure what to do with even. Colt came in from outside, stamping mud off his boots, and looked between them. He had the instinct of a man who had spent years reading the temperature of rooms full of people who did not like each other, and the temperature in this room registered on him immediately. He pulled out his chair and sat down without saying anything about it. "Wade," he said, "I need you to ride out to the north fence line this morning. There is a section the snow took down. I was planning to work Hellfire today." The table went quiet. Nora did not look up from her oatmeal. Colt's voice stayed level. The fence line needs to come first. A pause, the kind of pause that has weight in it. "Yes, sir," Wade said. Flat, final. He pushed back from the table. He passed behind Nora's chair on the way out. He did not say anything. He did not have to. She could feel the intention in his passing, the way you feel a cold draft from a cracked window. Not a blow, but a reminder that something outside was much colder than in here. And it was patient. Colt waited until the door closed. "Is there something I should know about?" he asked. "No," she said. He looked at her for a long moment with the expression of a man who is 90% certain he is being lied to and has decided to honor the lie for now. "All right," he said, and reached for the coffee. That afternoon, Nora went to the corral a second time, outside her usual morning routine. Hellfire heard her coming. She had learned the difference now between the way he reacted to her footsteps and the way he reacted to others. For everyone else, he moved to the far end and put his head down and his weight back on his haunches. Bracing. For her, he went still. Just still. Head up, ears forward, watching. It was not welcome. Not yet. But it was not bracing either. She stopped at the fence and held her hands open at her sides, the way she always did. "I know," she said quietly. "I know last night was bad. I am sorry I was not here." The horse breathed. His sides rose and fell. "It is not going to happen again," she said. "I cannot promise you the world, hellfire, but I can promise you that." She did not know if she could keep that promise. She said it anyway, because some promises are worth making even when you are not sure you can keep them. Because the making of them is itself a form of protection. Later that week, Nora made her first trip into Millhaven since her arrival. She went for supplies with the wagon. The looks started before she was fully off the seat. Not all of them hostile. Some were the looks of people who had heard the story, the street, the horse, the standing still, and were recalibrating. She had learned to recognize recalibration. It looked like a person who had already made a judgment trying to find somewhere to put a piece of information that did not fit. A woman she did not know fell into step beside her at the entrance to the general store. Older, silver-haired, the kind of posture that came from decades of refusing to apologize for taking up space. "You are Hargrove's wife," the woman said. "I am Dorothea Vane. My husband Fletcher runs the Vane spread 2 miles east of yours." She held the door open. "I heard about what you did with that horse. Word travels," Nora said. "It does!" Dorothea looked at her with the direct measuring gaze of a woman who had been conducting her own assessments for many years. "I also heard the town boys made a spectacle of you when you arrived." "They did. I am sorry for that." "You did not do it." "No. But I was here, and I did not stop it. And that is near enough the same thing." She let the door close behind them. "I am telling you because I prefer to say things outright." She paused. "You are going to find this is a hard country for a woman on her own terms. But it is not an impossible one." Nora looked at her. "I have never found anything impossible," she said. "Difficult, yes. Costly often. Not impossible." Dorothea Vane smiled. "A real one, the kind you earn." "Come to Sunday supper," she said. "My husband is dull but harmless, and I could use the company of a woman who is not afraid of her own opinions." "I would like that," Nora said. She was loading the last of the supplies into the wagon when she noticed him. Billy Crane, the boy who had called out on the street the day she arrived. He was sitting on the steps of the feed store across the road. He was watching her. He said nothing. He did not laugh. He looked at her for a long moment with the uncertain expression of someone who has formed a judgment and has recently received information that does not support it. Then he pulled off his hat. She almost stopped. She did not. She let it be what it was, a small and unglamorous and enormously important moment, of a person choosing differently than they had before. She climbed up to the wagon bench and drove on. She thought, as the horses found their rhythm on the frozen road and the mountains rose enormous and white on every side, that this was how things changed, not in speeches, not in confrontations. In moments like that one, small enough to miss if you were not paying attention. A boy taking off his hat, a woman who did not stop to acknowledge it, both of them moving forward. She drove home with the mountains closing in on every side and the cold pressing down and the distant sound of Hellfire, even from this far out, still pacing in his corral. She thought about the 7th morning and the whip and the 6 inches. She thought about patience and about what it cost, and about the stubborn thing she had always carried inside her, the kind that looked like softness from the outside and was something else entirely from within. She had not come to Montana to be easy. She had come because a man had written the word capable in a letter and meant it, and she intended to show him he had been right. She drove back to Hargrove Ranch that afternoon with the supply wagon and the cold at her back, and she did not speak of the boy with the hat, or Dorothea Vane's invitation, or the particular loosening she had felt on the road out of Millhaven. Some things were too new to name. She put them where she put most things that mattered, somewhere quiet and interior, and she went back to work. The days that followed had a rhythm to them. Up before the sun, out to the corral, back inside before the hands were stirring, breakfast, the root cellar in the morning, accounts in the afternoon, supper, then the silence of a house that was learning, slowly, how to hold 2 people who were still figuring out what they were to each other. Colt was fair. That was the word she kept returning to. Not warm, not yet, but fair in the way of a man who meant what he said and said what he meant, and did not occupy more space than he needed. She had not known many men like that. She was still learning what to do with one. Wade Pruitt said nothing more about the horse, but she felt his watching continue. Quiet, patient, the way a man watches when he has decided to wait rather than act. She understood that kind of patience. She had practiced it herself for most of her life. She recognized it in him, and she did not underestimate it. The 9th morning changed something. She had been at the fence for 40 minutes in the dark when Hellfire walked to the near end of the corral, not charging, not pacing, walking, with the deliberate, unhurried movement of an animal making a choice. He stopped 2 feet from the posts, directly in front of her, and dropped his head until his nose was nearly level with the top rail. His breath came out in visible clouds in the morning cold. She could count the scars on him from where she stood, the thick ridge along his neck from a rope burn, the striations on his flanks, the healed-over notch in his left ear she had been wondering about since the first morning. She did not reach for him. She stood with her hands wrapped around her coffee mug, and she let him look at her, and she looked back. "Hello," she said. His ear turned. She stood there until her coffee went cold and then stood some more. She talked. She told him about Ohio and about her mother's garden and about the first horse she had ever known. A big roan named Buckner who had belonged to her father and who had been so gentle he could be ridden by children still learning to hold the reins. She told him she had not ridden a horse in 6 years. She told him about the letter, about reading it at her kitchen table 3 times, because no man had ever advertised for capable instead of pretty before. "I do not know if this is going to work," she told him. "Any of it. The horse, the ranch, the rest of it." She stopped. "But I am staying. I want you to know that. Whatever happens, I am not the kind of woman who leaves when things get hard." Hellfire's nose crossed the top fence rail. Not far. Just the tip of his nose clearing the rail and hanging in the cold air between them. She did not move. She breathed in and she breathed out, and she held every muscle in her body perfectly still. She had learned that any movement now, any reaching, Any eagerness, any response that came from her need rather than his readiness, would push him back. She had learned that the way she had learned most things, by having it done wrong to her first. His nose touched her hand. Cold and rough and real, she closed her eyes. 1 second, 2. Then he pulled back and turned and walked to the center of the corral and stood there with his back to her, the way horses do when they are done with something but have not fully decided what to do next. She opened her eyes. She looked at the print his breath had left on the back of her hand, still warm against the cold. She did not say anything. She did not celebrate. She just picked up her empty mug and walked back to the house. And she felt something moving through her chest that was not quite joy and not quite relief, but something that lived between them. A door that had been locked for a very long time, opening just enough to let in light. She told Colt that evening, not dramatically, not triumphantly. She sat down across from him in the kitchen while he was going through the week's supply orders, and she said simply that Hellfire had touched her hand that morning through the rail. Colt set down his pencil. "I did not reach for him," she said. "He came to me." For a moment he looked at her with something that was not quite disbelief, but was working its way past it. Then he said, "How long have you been going out there every morning 9 days?" He picked up his pencil and set it down again. "Hellfire has put 3 men in the dirt in the last 2 months. One of them still cannot close his left hand all the way. I know. And he came to you. He came to me." Colt looked at the supply ledger and then out the window at the dark yard. "Wade is going to say you imagined it. Wade is welcome to stand at that fence himself tomorrow morning and see what the horse does for him." Something in Colt's expression shifted. The thing she had noticed before that looked like recognition. "You would let him." "I am not in the business of keeping things secret. The horse does not belong to me. The progress belongs to the horse. Anyone who wants to observe it is welcome to." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Can I ask you something personal?" She folded her hands on the table. "You can try. Your first husband. You said he was unkind. Did he know what you were capable of before?" She looked at him steadily. "He decided what I was capable of the week after we married," she said, "and he never looked again." Colt nodded slowly. He turned the pencil over in his fingers. "My wife," he said. He stopped. Started again. "Eleanor understood this ranch in ways I could not always articulate. Not the cattle, not the land. I knew those things. But the people, the way a crew held together or did not, the temperature of a room." He paused. "I have not had anyone here in 3 years who understood that." She waited. "I do not say that to put pressure on you," he said. "I say it because I think you deserve to know what you have been doing here this past week and a half. The root cellar, Hobie, the inventory, the horse." He set down the pencil. "You have been seen." She sat with that. It was a simple thing. 3 words. She thought about how many years she had gone without them, and how much space they occupied now that someone had said them. "Thank you," she said. Then, because she had been honest her whole life even when honesty cost her, she added, "I do not know yet what this is between us. I think we are both too careful to be hasty about it. But I think you are a fair man, and I have not had one of those before, so I am not sure yet what to do with it." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "I reckon we have got time to figure that out." She nodded. She went to bed thinking about fair, about what it cost and what it meant. She was 11 days in when she found the whip again. Same post, same position. As if whoever had left it wanted her to know it was deliberate. Hellfire was in the far corner of the corral, with his head low and his sides heaving. From where she stood, she could see the marks on his left flank. Thin parallel lines, red against the black of his winter coat. 1 week of progress, undone again. Nora stood very still. She thought about walking into the bunkhouse and saying what she needed to say in front of every man on that ranch. She thought about putting the whip on Colt's breakfast table. She thought about a dozen things she had the right to do and the cause to do. Then she looked at Hellfire, who was watching her with his head still low, and she thought about what would happen to him if she turned this into a war right now. A war she might not win yet. A war that would put him at the center of it. She picked up the whip. She walked back to the main house. She went into the kitchen where Hobie was starting the breakfast fire, and she opened the door of the iron stove and she fed the whip into it piece by piece. Hobie watched the whole thing without saying a word. When she was done, she poured herself a cup of coffee and sat down at the table. "You did not see that," she told him. Hobie stirred the oats. "See what, ma'am?" She was at the breakfast table when Wade came in. He helped himself to coffee and sat at his end of the table. He said to nobody in particular that the horse had been worked up in the night again, that some of the younger hands needed to learn to stay clear of the corral after dark. He said it the way he always said such things. Sideways. Not quite at her. This time she looked up. She looked at him with the steadiness she had been practicing since she was 16 years old. The steadiness of a woman who has been in rooms with men who wanted her to flinch and had learned to breathe through the wanting. "Thank you for the update," she said. Same words as before. Same tone. Nothing in her face to give him. His eyes narrowed the same small degree. He went back to his plate. Colt came in from outside and registered the room and said nothing about it and poured his coffee. He looked at Wade once, brief, direct. Then he looked at Nora. She gave him the smallest shake of her head she could manage. He sat down. She did not forget, but she did not stop going to the corral. She found the whip a third time on the morning of the 14th day. Same post. But this time Hellfire was in the far corner with his head pressed into the fence boards. His breathing was ragged and loud. 3 red lines crossed his right shoulder. Fresh. Done within the last hour. Something settled into place inside Nora that was colder than the morning and cleaner than anger. Not fury. Something past fury. The clarity that comes when patience has finally reached its limit, and what replaces it is not rage but resolution. She picked up the whip. She did not go to the stove this time. She carried it across the yard to where Wade Pruitt was checking a buckle on his saddle near the barn, and she stopped 2 feet from him and held it out in front of her, horizontal, so he could see it clearly in the thin morning light. He looked at it. He looked at her. He did not say anything. She kept her voice quiet because the quiet was the point. "How many times?" she said. He said nothing. "How many times did you go into that corral with a whip?" The muscle in his jaw tightened. "I was trying to get that animal under control before someone else gets hurt. It is my job to keep this ranch safe." "You went in 3 times," she said. "And you walked out 3 times because he chose not to kill you. Not because you controlled him. Because he chose." She lowered the whip but did not put it down. "That choice is the only thing keeping this ranch safe. You destroy that. You do not have a dangerous horse anymore. You have a dead one. Or a dead man. I know horses, Mrs. Bassett." "You know breaking horses," she said. "There is a difference." She looked at him steadily. "I am not going to take this to Colt. Not today. You want to know why?" He said nothing, but he did not look away. "Because you are afraid of that horse," she said. "You have been afraid of him since the day he came onto this property, and that fear turned into cruelty the way it always does when a man will not admit to being afraid. And if I tell Colt what you have done, you lose your position, and you have got nothing else." She paused. "And that does not help the horse, and it does not help you. And I did not come all the way to Montana to make things worse." Wade Pruitt stood in the cold and looked at a woman he had written off the moment she stepped down from the stagecoach in Millhaven. She watched him try to find a shape for what she had just said that he could be angry at. and she watched him fail. "You do not know anything about me," he said finally, but it came out quieter than he intended. "I know you are good at your job," she said. "I have watched you these past 2 weeks. You know this ranch, and you care about it. And a man who cares about a place does not usually go around trying to hurt things just to hurt them." She paused. "You were trying to fix something. I understand that. You just had the wrong tools." He looked at the corral. Hellfire, at the near fence line now, was watching Wade with the focus of an animal cataloging a threat. Ears forward, nostrils wide, weight shifted back. "He will never trust me," Wade said. The anger had left his voice. What was underneath was something older. "No," she said honestly. "Probably not. Not after what happened." She let that sit. "But that is not the same as useless. There is more to this ranch than one horse." He was quiet for a long time. Then, without another word, he turned and walked back toward the barn. She stood at the fence in the early cold and let her hands stop shaking. They had been shaking since she first called his name 15 minutes ago, and she had not let him see it. She breathed out everything she had been holding. Behind her, she heard Hellfire push his nose over the rail and nudge her shoulder. She startled. He startled. They stood there a full second, both surprised by the other. Then she pressed her palm gently against the side of his face, and he let her. And she stood in the cold Montana morning with her hand against the face of the most dangerous horse on the ranch. And she thought that this was why she had come, not for the ease of it, not because it was simple or safe or because anyone had told her she was equal to it, but because she was, and she had always known it. And Montana was simply the first place that had given her enough room to prove it. She did not know that Emmett was watching from the shadow of the barn doorway. She did not know that he had seen the whole thing. She did not know that by breakfast the following morning, every hand on Hargrove Ranch would know what she had done. Not the whips, not the confrontation, but the specific small miracle of Hellfire nudging her shoulder in the cold. And she did not know that Wade Pruitt had stood in the bunkhouse doorway long after she had gone inside, looking at the corral in the dark, wearing an expression that was not anger and not contempt. It was something he had not worn in a long time. It looked, from a distance, like shame. The morning after, the ranch felt different. She noticed it the moment she walked into the kitchen. The hands were at the table earlier than usual, and the quality of their silence was not the hostile silence she had been eating breakfast inside of for 2 weeks. It was something else, the silence of men who have something to say and are waiting to see who goes first. Emmett went first. He was terrible at waiting. "I saw it," he said before she had even set her coffee down. "At the corral yesterday morning. The whole thing." She looked at him. "Wade," he said. "And then the horse." He glanced around the table. "I told Theron. Theron told Orrin. Orrin Dace, lean and sun-darkened, who had not said a single word directly to her in 2 weeks, was looking at his coffee mug now with the expression of someone deciding something. "That horse has not touched a soul in 8 months," Orrin said. "To the table, mostly. But loud enough." He touched her. Emmett said. Nobody argued. She sat down and ate her oatmeal and said nothing because nothing needed to be said. The information was in the room and it was doing its own work. She had learned long ago that the best thing you could do when the truth was working for you was to stay out of its way. Wade's chair was empty. She did not ask about it. Colt came in from outside and took his seat and registered the empty chair and looked at Nora once, brief and direct. She gave him the smallest nod she could manage. He poured his coffee. "Orrin," he said, "I need you on the east pasture after breakfast. Take Emmett." "Yes, sir," Orrin said. The chair stayed empty all through the meal. She found Wade at the corral that afternoon. He was standing at the fence, not where she usually stood. but at the far corner with his hat in his hands and his back to the yard. Hellfire was at the far end, doing what Hellfire did when he was watching carefully, not moving, just present, alert. She considered leaving him to it. She walked to her usual spot instead and leaned on her post and looked at the horse. Neither of them spoke for a while. "I have been doing this job 15 years, Wade said finally. His voice was directed at the air in front of him more than at her. "Never met a horse I could not work. Never met a situation I could not manage if I was patient enough and firm enough and did not let the animal get the upper hand." She waited. "Then that animal came on this property." He stopped, started again, pushing the words out harder. "I was afraid. First day. Walked up to the corral to assess him, and I could feel it before I was even close. Could not let anybody see it." He turned his hat over in his hands. "Could not let myself see it. Fear makes sense," she said. "That horse was built to inspire it. It is not supposed to matter. That is what every man I ever worked under told me. Fear is something you push through, something you do not let show. Then every man you worked under was wrong." He looked at her then. Really looked. The way he had not in 2 weeks. "Fear does not make you weak," she said. "What you do with it does." He was quiet for a long time. "I am sorry," he said. "About the whips. About trying to set back what you were building." The word cost him. She could see it. She nodded, accepted it. Did not make him say more. "You are not what I thought you were," he said. "When you got off that coach, I know what you thought. I am not proud of it." "Good," she said, without cruelty. "That is the right thing to feel." He put his hat back on and walked away. And something in the set of his shoulders was different than it had been before. "What do you need from me?" he said, stopping once more, "to help with the horse." She looked at him for a moment. She thought about what it cost him to ask that. She thought about what it meant that he had. "Stop being the thing he braces for," she said. "You do not have to do anything. Just stop being another threat he has to account for. If you can do that, you have done enough." He nodded once. "Firm. I can do that." He went into the barn, and she turned to the corral, and Hellfire was looking at her from across the enclosure with his ears forward and his head up. "I know," she told him quietly. "I was surprised too." She went into the corral for the first time on the 19th day. She told Colt the night before, not asking, telling, because she had made herself a rule in this arrangement, and she was beginning to think it might become something more than an arrangement, that she would not ask permission for things she intended to do anyway, but she would not do them behind his back. "I am going in tomorrow morning," she said. He set down his pen. "Is he ready?" "I think so. I think he has been ready for 3 days, and I have been the one who needed more time." He looked at her across the table with the expression she had been getting better at reading. It was not the management face he wore for the ranch. It was something with more weather in it. "You want company?" "No. If something goes wrong, I want one less person for him to be frightened of. And if something goes very wrong, you will hear it." She met his eyes. "And you can come running." He did not laugh, but the line of his shoulders changed in a way that meant something. "All right," he said. "I will not watch. Thank you." She went to the corral in the gray pre-dawn and did her usual routine first. The fence post, the open hands, the quiet talking. She needed Hellfire to know this morning was still her morning, still the same as every morning before it became something else. Then she unlatched the gate. Hellfire heard it. His whole body changed. She watched the tension move through him from head to flank. She came through the gate and latched it behind her. She did not walk toward him. She stood just inside the fence, and she looked at the ground, soft and sideways. And she waited. 30 seconds, a minute. The horse made a sound, not a warning. Not the scream she had heard the day he had broken from the pen. A lower sound. Rougher. More uncertain. Like a question. "I am here," she said. Barely a whisper. "Take your time. 2 minutes. 5. She heard him move. Not toward her. He moved in a long lateral arc, keeping his distance, testing the perimeter of the space she occupied. She tracked him with her peripheral vision and stayed perfectly still. He was enormous up close in the same enclosure, larger than he looked from outside the fence. She felt the reality of him in her chest, the very real possibility of everything that could go wrong. She breathed through it. He made another arc, smaller. He was spiraling inward the way water finds the lowest point, not quickly, not directly, but inevitably. When his nose reached her shoulder, she had been standing in the cold for 11 minutes. She let him investigate her coat, her hair, the side of her face. She let him make his own assessment because this was his decision to make, not hers. She had spent too long having decisions made for her by people who had not asked. She was not going to do the same to him. Then she raised her hand slowly. She laid her palm flat against his neck. He flinched. The flinch moved through his whole body like a current. She did not pull back. She kept her hand there, steady and warm. "You are all right," she said. "You are all right. Nobody is going to take this from you." The flinch subsided, and then, slowly, the way trust always comes. Not in a rush, but in a long exhale. He lowered his head against her hand. She felt his whole body settle. She closed her eyes and stayed exactly where she was. When she came out of the corral 20 minutes later, Colt was standing at the kitchen door with 2 mugs of coffee. He held one out to her. She took it with both hands and stood beside him on the step. "He let me touch him," she said. Colt looked at the corral for a long time. "In 20 years of working with horses," he said slowly, "I have never seen anything like what you have done with that animal." She drank her coffee. "I mean that," he said. "I know you do." She looked at him. "That is why I like hearing you say it." He looked at her with that expression, the one with weather in it, and she looked back. And neither of them said what was in the air between them, because they were both careful people, and there was no need to rush what was already clearly on its way. The letter arrived on a Thursday. It came on the afternoon stage addressed to Colt, not to Nora, and she saw him read it at the kitchen table after supper while she was going over the winter accounts. She watched his face change as he read, not dramatically, not with alarm exactly, but with the tightening of a man receiving information he had not planned for. He folded the letter, set it on the table, looked at it, picked it up, read it again. "What is it?" she asked. He looked at her, and she saw the careful arrangement of a man trying to decide how to say something. "Just tell me," she said. He put the letter on the table and turned it toward her. "It is from your late husband's brother, Calvin Bassett. He says he is in Billings. He says that as William's widow you have obligations to the Bassett estate that you abandoned by leaving Ohio. He says there are debts, and he says that if you have remarried, the marriage may not be valid." She read the letter herself. She read it twice with the specific care of someone who has learned not to react to words until she has understood exactly what those words are trying to do. Calvin Bassett, 34 years old, 2 years younger than William and meaner by a decade. A man who had been making quiet calculations about the farm she had been left with since William was buried. She understood with cold clarity exactly what this was. Not a legal matter. A pressure tactic. Calvin had not come to Billings out of concern for his brother's estate. He had come because she had left and taken the only thing that was actually William's, the farm, which she had sold to fund the journey west, and he intended to get something back. She set the letter down. "What do you want to do?" Colt asked. She looked at him. What do you want to do? He did not hesitate. I want to send my lawyer a letter tonight and have Calvin Bassett understand by the end of the month that this marriage is valid. The debts are not your obligation, and if he would like to continue pressing the matter, he is welcome to say so to my face. That might not be enough, she said. He is the kind of man who does not stop when he is told to stop. He stops when it costs him something. Then we make it cost him something. She felt the solidity of a man who meant what he said, standing behind those words. I will write him myself, she said. Colt looked at her. He is my problem from my life, she said. I will handle him. But I would be grateful if your lawyer sent a letter at the same time. So Calvin understands this is not just me. Colt considered that. That is reasonable. I know it is. He made the sound that was almost a laugh. She wrote the letter that night, 3 paragraphs, not cruel and not soft, and not leaving Calvin Bassett any interpretive room whatsoever. She told him what the farm had sold for and what William's debts had amounted to, and what the balance was between them. She told him she had legal counsel. She told him any further contact on this matter should be directed to said counsel. She told him she wished him well in his life and had no interest in his presence in hers. She sealed it and set it beside Colt's lawyer letter on the hall table, and went to bed and slept better than she had in 3 weeks. 2 days later, Calvin sent a second letter. This one addressed to Colt, not to Nora, to Colt, as if she were a matter to be managed between men rather than a person who had written him a perfectly clear response already. She was at breakfast when Colt opened it. She watched his jaw set. He wants money, Colt said. He is threatening to contest the marriage in territorial court. She kept her voice quiet. I need to handle this. Not you. Me. I know you do. But he is threatening this household. He is threatening me, she said. This household is how he thinks he gets to me. She folded her hands on the table. I need the men to hear something before you respond to Calvin, and I need to say it myself. He studied her. What are you going to say? What needs to be said? After breakfast, while the hands were readying for the morning's work, she stood in the yard. She did not call them together. She did not need to. They were there, and she spoke at a volume that reached all of them. There is a man in Billings, she said, who has written 2 letters now trying to undo this marriage. He does not like that I left Ohio. He does not like that I am here. He does not like that things did not go the way he planned. She looked at the men, at Emmett, at Orrin Dace, at Theron Quill, at Wade. Standing by the barn door, with his arms crossed and his eyes steady, I want you all to know, because you are the people of this ranch, and you deserve to know, that I am not going anywhere. Nobody said anything. I also want to say something I have not said out loud since I arrived here. She said, because I was raised not to make demands of people who had not invited them, and because I spent 32 years learning to make myself small enough to fit in rooms that were not built for me. She paused. I am done doing that. Emmett's expression was completely open. Wade's was unreadable but not hostile. I do not need you to find me pretty, she said. I do not need you to find me delicate or graceful or the right kind of woman in whatever way you have been taught women ought to be. I need you to stop mistaking cruelty for honesty and size for weakness and silence for acceptance. She looked at each of them, not challenging, not angry, just clear. Clearer than she had been allowed to be in 32 years. I am the woman of this ranch. I have earned that, the same as any of you has earned your place here. I will continue to earn it every day I am here. That is all I ask of myself, and it is all I ask of you. The yard was quiet. Then Orrin Dace said to no one in particular, she earned it the day she stood in front of that horse in the street. Way I see it. Theron Quill said, I reckon so. Emmett said nothing. He did not need to. His face said everything a face could say. Wade, by the barn door, straightened and pushed off from the wall. He looked at her across the yard with the expression she had last seen in the early morning at the corral, the one that cost him something to wear. "Nobody on this property is going anywhere," he said, "including her." He picked up the saddle at his feet. "We have got work to do." He went into the barn. One by one, the men followed. Colt came to stand beside her. He was quiet for a moment. "You did not need me," he said finally. "I never said I needed you to fight for me," she said. "I said I needed you to be fair." She looked at him. "You have been. Every day you have been." He held her gaze. "Calvin is going to send another letter. Let him," she said. She put her hands in her coat pockets and found the lavender and held it. "Let him write all the letters he wants. He can write until his hand gives out. It will not change what this is." "What is this?" Colt asked. And the question was not about Calvin Bassett. She was quiet for a moment. She thought about Ohio and the stagecoach and the flour sack in the street, and 19 days at a fence and a horse that chose not to destroy. "This is a life," she said, "a real one. Maybe the first one I have had." He took her hand. He held it with the same deliberate steadiness with which he held everything. Tools, reins, difficult truths. She held it back. From the corral, Hellfire moved along the fence line in the direction of their voices, not pacing, not restless, just coming closer. Hellfire stood at the near fence line and did not pace. That was the thing Nora noticed in the days that followed. He had stopped pacing. In the first weeks, she had come to know the sound of his restlessness, the way you come to know the sounds of a house you have lived in long enough. The rhythm of hooves on frozen ground that told her the state of him before she ever reached the corral. Now the corral was quiet in the mornings. Not empty. He was there. But still. The way a creature is still when it has decided the place it occupies is not a threat. She did not say this to anyone. She did not need to. The men had eyes. Wade submitted his resignation on a Thursday morning in late February, 6 weeks after Nora had arrived in Millhaven. He gave it to Colt first, folded and brief, the way men like Wade communicate the things that cost them the most. Then he came to find Nora at the corral. She heard him coming across the frozen yard and knew his footsteps by now the same way she knew Hellfire's. Wade Pruitt walked like a man who had spent 15 years knowing exactly where he stood and was only now discovering the ground had shifted. He stopped at the fence beside her, not where she stood, a few feet down, the same corner where she had first found him that afternoon, when he had been looking at Hellfire with the hat in his hands, and something in his face that did not belong to an angry man. "I gave Colt my notice this morning, he said. "Going to my brother's spread in Wyoming. He runs cattle in the Laramie Basin. Good work, fair wages." He paused. "I wanted you to know before you heard it from somebody else." "I appreciate that," she said. He was quiet a moment. Hellfire, at the near fence line, was watching him with the attention he gave to Wade specifically. Not aggression, not fear, the careful watchfulness of an animal that has decided to observe rather than react. "He will never come to me," Wade said. "No," she said. "Probably not." She did not soften it because he was not asking her to. He nodded slowly. "I used to think that was the measure of a man, whether an animal would come to you." He looked at the horse. "I understand now that it might be the measure of something else entirely." She said nothing to that because it did not need a response. "What I did to him," Wade said, "I cannot undo it. I know that." He turned his hat over in his hands, the gesture she had come to recognize as his version of searching for words. "I just wanted to say that what you built here with him, what you built with the men, with this place—" He stopped. "I am a better hand than I was when you got off that coach. I did not expect that. I want you to know I know it. I am glad, she said simply. He put his hat back on and straightened it. He extended his hand. She took it and shook it the way she shook everything, without ceremony and without smallness. You are going to be all right. Wade Pruitt, she said. He almost smiled. So are you, Mrs. Hargrove. It was the first time anyone had called her that. She noticed it and did not say so. She watched him walk back toward the bunkhouse, and she thought about the distance a person can travel inside 6 weeks without moving more than 4 miles from a single ranch house in Montana Territory. She rode Hellfire for the first time 3 days after Wade left. She had not planned it for that particular morning. She had gone to the corral the way she always did, in the dark, before the rest of the ranch was stirring. But something was different. Hellfire came to the gate when he heard her footsteps, not to the fence line, to the gate itself. He stood there with his head over the top rail and his ears forward and his eyes on her, with the directness of an animal that has made a decision and is waiting for the other party to catch up. She stood on the outside of the gate and looked at him for a long moment. Is that what you want? She said. He did not move. She unlatched the gate. She went through it. She stood inside the corral and waited, but he did not do his usual spiral. He simply turned so that his left side was toward her, and he stood there, and the meaning of it was plain enough that she did not require any further conversation. She had ridden horses before, but not in 6 years, and never a horse like this. She knew that. She felt the knowing of it in her chest as she moved to his side, slow and deliberate, and laid her hand flat on his back and felt the warmth of him, and the reality of him, and the considerable size of what she was proposing. All right, she told him. All right. All. She used the fence rail to help herself up, her weight full and real and considerable. The weight of a woman who had been told her whole life she was too much for most things, and she settled it across his back and she felt him hold it, feel it, take the measure of it, and decide to keep holding it. He moved when she asked, and stopped when she asked, and turned when she asked. And the asking was in the shift of her weight and the pressure of her legs, and none of it was force, and none of it was negotiation. And all of it was the language they had been building together over the course of 19 mornings and more cold hours than she had counted. They went the length of the corral, then a wide circle in the frozen yard outside, because he had walked through the gate of his own will and she had let him. By the time she brought him back to the gate, the full morning crew had found urgent business in the vicinity of the corral. Emmett was checking a fence post that did not need checking. Theron Quill was examining a water trough with the focused attention of a man who had not looked at it once in 6 weeks. Orrin Dace was leaning on the barn wall with his arms crossed and his eyes forward, and a stillness about him that meant he had been standing there since before she had gone through the gate. When she dismounted, the yard was quiet. Then Emmett said, "Well, I will be," Orrin said. "Watch yourself." Theron Quill started laughing. Not mockery, the real kind. The kind that comes out when something exceeds what you thought was possible, and your body does not know what else to do with the excess. Colt was at the fence. He had been there the whole time. She had known it without looking. He had promised not to watch, and here he was. And that was the thing about Colt Hargrove. He kept his word, except when keeping it required him not to be present for something that mattered. "Well," she said. "I was not watching," he said. "And yet here you are." "Here I am," he agreed. He was smiling. A real one. Not the almost smile she had been collecting since the first day. The full thing. She had not seen it before, and she thought it was worth every cold morning she had stood at a fence in the dark to be on the receiving end of it now. She put her hand on Hellfire's neck and felt him lean into it. "We will go further tomorrow," she said, mostly to herself, mostly to the horse. "Further," Colt repeated, and shook his head. and walked back to the house looking like a man who had decided to stop being surprised by his wife and had arrived instead at something quieter and more durable. Gratitude, maybe, the kind that does not announce itself. Calvin Bassett arrived in Millhaven on a Wednesday in early March. Not a letter this time, not a lawyer, Calvin himself, in a traveling coat that had been purchased for a different climate and boots that were already dark with mud from the depot road, accompanied by a young man named Aldous Finch, whose coat fit him poorly and whose expression communicated that he had not fully understood what the Billings to Millhaven leg of the journey would involve when he had agreed to take this case. Nora did not know they were coming. Nobody did. That was deliberate on Calvin's part. He was the kind of man who understood that surprise was an advantage and who had used it his whole life against people he suspected would be more prepared than him if given time to think. She was in the root cellar doing the late winter inventory when Hobie came down the steps with his careful step that meant he was carrying news he did not want to deliver. "There are 2 men at the house, ma'am," he said. "One of them says he is family." She set down the ledger. She did not hurry. She climbed the steps and walked across the yard and went through the front door of the main house at her own pace, which was not slow and was not frantic, and was the pace of a woman who had decided before she reached the door that whatever was on the other side of it was not going to determine the speed at which she moved through her own home. Colt was in the front room, standing, not sitting, which told her the temperature of things before she saw the 2 men across from him. Calvin had the look she remembered from William's funeral, the expression of a man who is performing a reasonable grievance so thoroughly that he has begun to believe it himself. Aldous Finch stood slightly behind and to the left, with a leather satchel, and the expression of a man who would very much like to be somewhere warmer. Calvin looked at Nora when she came in, and something moved across his face that was not exactly surprise, but was the cousin of it, the slight recalibration of a man who had built a plan around one version of a person and was now confronted with another. "Nora," he said. "Calvin," she said. She did not say it was good to see him, because it was not, and she had given up saying things that were not true sometime around her 25th year. "I came because your letter left a great deal unresolved." He said. "My letter was quite clear," she said. She moved to the chair nearest the window and sat down. She did not invite him to sit. The decision about whether he sat in this room was Colt's to make, and she watched Colt make it by saying nothing and remaining standing, which communicated in the language of a rancher on his own property exactly the status of this visit. Calvin pressed forward the way men like Calvin always pressed forward when they sensed resistance, by speaking louder and with greater certainty, as if volume were the same as validity. "The Bassett estate has claims that predate your marriage to Mr. Hargrove, he said. William's debts, the question of the farm sale. These are matters that require proper legal resolution, and your departure from Ohio did not resolve them. It simply relocated them." There were no outstanding Bassett estate claims. Nora said, "There were William's personal debts, which were settled by the sale of the farm, which was legally mine." She looked at him with the steadiness she had been practicing on harder material than Calvin Bassett for months now. William's lawyer in Columbus confirmed this in writing. Our lawyer here in Montana has confirmed it as well. You have received 2 letters stating this, and you are in this room regardless. Which tells me this visit is not about the law. Calvin's jaw tightened. "It tells me," she continued, "that you are hoping that being present in person, in my home, will accomplish what letters have not." She paused. "It will not. Your marriage," Calvin said, "carrying the weight of a man who has decided to use his final piece, may not be legally binding in this territory. There are questions about the timing, about proper resolution of prior obligations." Colt spoke for the first time. His voice was exactly what it always was, level and unhurried and carrying the gravity of a man who had no need to perform authority because he simply had it. "The marriage is legal," he said, "documented and filed with the territorial clerk the week after it was performed. Our lawyer is in Billings. His name is Richard Bain. If you have a legal argument to make, you are welcome to make it to him, and he will answer it." He looked at Calvin without aggression and without warmth. "That is the only conversation about this subject that this household will be having." Finch, behind Calvin, had stopped writing on his small notepad. He was looking at his boots. Calvin tried once more. He was not a man who knew how to stop when stopping was the correct choice. He spoke about family obligation and about William's memory and about what was owed to the Bassett name, and the speech had clearly been prepared, and it clearly had not accounted for walking into a room with both Nora and Colt Hargrove and finding neither of them uncertain. The front door opened. Dorothea Vane came in with the confidence of a woman who had been walking into other people's homes unannounced for 40 years and had never once felt the need to apologize for it. She had a covered dish in one arm, because it was Sunday and she had been coming to Sunday supper at Hargrove Ranch for 3 weeks now. And she registered the scene in the front room with the quick, complete assessment of a woman who had navigated harder rooms than this one. She set the dish on the hall table. She looked at Calvin, she looked at Finch, she looked at Nora. Then she walked into the front room and sat down in the second chair as if she had been invited and expected, which she had not been and was not. "Dorothea Vane," she said to Calvin, pleasantly. "My husband Fletcher and I run the Vane spread 2 miles east." She folded her hands in her lap. I could not help overhearing. In a house this size, one cannot help it. She tilted her head at Finch with the expression of a woman examining something that has been left out in the rain. "I would recommend, if you intend to pursue any of this in a territorial court, that you engage representation with more experience in Montana property law." She paused. "The altitude alone takes some adjustment." Finch looked at his notepad. Calvin looked at the room. He looked at Colt, who had not moved. He looked at Nora, who had not moved. He looked at Dorothea Vane, who was sitting in his chair with an expression of serene immovability. He looked at the hall table where Dorothea's covered dish was sitting, which was already making the room smell like something far more welcoming than this conversation. He picked up his hat. "You will be hearing from my lawyer," he said. It was the last weapon a man like Calvin had when the others had not worked, and she heard it for what it was. A closing line, not a threat, a face-saving exit. "Our lawyer will be delighted to correspond with him," Nora said. Calvin left. Finch followed, with the walk of a young man who has spent the last 20 minutes reconsidering his professional choices. The door closed. Dorothea looked at Nora. Then she looked at Colt. Then she reached over and patted Nora's hand once, brisk and practical. "Now then," she said, "shall we eat?" The word in Millhaven reached the town before Calvin Bassett's stagecoach did. Billy Crane had been outside the general store across from the Hargrove Lane when Calvin and Finch had passed through town on their way to the ranch, and Billy Crane had been outside the same store 2 hours later when they came back considerably faster than they had gone. And a boy of 12 who has been paying attention to something for 6 weeks knows the difference between a man who has gotten what he came for and a man who has not. By morning, the version circulating at the feed store was that Nora Hargrove had thrown Calvin Bassett off her property with 2 words and a look. By afternoon, the version at the saloon had her doing it in front of half the ranch crew. By the time it reached the women's auxiliary meeting at the Methodist church, it had acquired a detail about Dorothea Vane arriving with a covered dish that turned out to be absolutely accurate, which Dorothea herself confirmed when asked. "She served apple cake," Dorothea said, "which I thought was appropriate. Nora heard none of this firsthand because she was not in town and was not in the habit of frequenting Methodist auxiliary meetings. But Emmett, who was terrible at keeping anything to himself, told her on Thursday with the gleeful energy of a 17-year-old who considers himself an insider. "The whole town is talking about you," he said. "The whole town was talking about me when I arrived," she said. "She was oiling a harness in the barn. They were saying different things then. Emmett thought about that." "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I reckon they were." The letter from Richard Bain arrived in the 3rd week of March. 3 paragraphs, professional and conclusive. Calvin Bassett had no legal claim on the Hargrove household, on the proceeds of the farm sale, or on the validity of the marriage. If he wished to pursue the matter in territorial court, he was welcome to do so at his own considerable expense and with the full expectation of losing. There was a note at the bottom from Bain in his own hand, saying he had made some inquiries, and that Calvin Bassett did not have the resources for a sustained legal action, and almost certainly knew it. She read the letter at the kitchen table and set it down and drank her coffee. Colt was watching her from across the table. "Is that it?" he asked. She thought about Calvin in his city coat, with his mud-darkened boots, and the way he had looked when Dorothea Vane sat down in his chair. She thought about the farm in Columbus and William's relentlessness, and the 8 years she had spent being corrected in a house that had been supposed to be hers. She thought about the stagecoach and the 6 days across 3 territories, and the flour sack in the mud and 19 cold mornings at a fence. "That is it," she said. "For Calvin. He does not have the money for a real fight. He was hoping the threat would do the work." She wrapped her hands around her mug. Men like him always are. Colt nodded slowly. He turned his coffee mug in his hands. Then he said, "I should have come to Ohio myself instead of sending a letter." "You could not have found me," she said. "I did not know I existed yet. Not this version of me." He looked at her with the expression she had been accumulating since January, the one that had weather in it and was not managed. "You gave me the place to land," she said. "That is not nothing. That is everything," he said. She held his gaze. Outside, in the corral, Hellfire stood in the afternoon light and did not pace. The storm came in April, not January, which was the thing about Montana that Nora was still learning. Winter in Ohio had a schedule. It arrived in November and it left in March, and in between it conducted itself with the grudging predictability of something that understood its own limits. Montana did not operate on that principle. Montana operated on the principle that it would do what it wanted when it wanted, and the appropriate response was to be ready. She had felt it building for 2 days, a change in the quality of the cold, something different in the way the cattle were moving in the far north pasture, a gathering and pressing together that was not their usual behavior. And Hellfire, most of all Hellfire, who had been walking the north fence line since the morning before, with a restlessness that was not his old fear pacing, but something atmospheric and aware. She mentioned it at supper on the second evening. "There is a big storm coming," she said. 2 days, maybe less. Orrin Dace looked up from his plate. "Sky has been clear all week. The cattle are bunching on the north end," she said, "and Hellfire has been working the north fence since yesterday morning. He did not do that before the last cold snap either, and that one took down 2 fence sections." The men exchanged looks, not dismissive. They were past dismissive with her now, but uncertain. Montana weather reading was its own expertise, and she was still in her first winter here. "Orrin," Colt said. "What do you think Orrin considered?" "There is a smell to it," he said finally. "Could be. Move the cattle to the lower pasture first thing tomorrow," Colt said. "Get the extra feed into the barn before noon." It came that night. Not tomorrow. That night, while they were sleeping. The temperature dropped 20 degrees and the wind came off the mountains with the force that has geography behind it. something old and enormous and entirely indifferent to the plans of ranchers and their crews. She woke to the sound of it at 2 a.m. and lay in the dark and felt the house shudder and thought, "Too soon." We did not move them. She was up and dressed before the first boot sounded in the hallway. Colt came into the kitchen already in his coat, already moving with the compressed efficiency of a man who had woken up to emergencies before and knew that the only useful response was immediate action. "The cattle ran north," he said, "spooked by the wind. They are on the ridge." "How bad is the trail?" "Orrin is checking the horses now." He looked at her. "Stay here. I need someone here who knows where everything is and who will not lose their head if we are out longer than planned." He said it plainly, without condescension. "I need you here, Nora. Can you do that?" She understood what he was asking. She hated it the way you hate necessary things. "Yes," she said. He put his hand on her face. Brief, warm, deliberate. Then he went out into the storm with Orrin and Theron Quill and 2 of the other hands, and she stood at the window and watched the lanterns disappear into the dark and the white. They did not come back at dawn. She told herself that was expected. The North Ridge was a long ride in good weather. She went to the barn and stood with Hellfire for 10 minutes and did not speak because she did not have anything useful to say to him about it. He stood close to the fence and watched her with his ears forward and his breath making clouds in the cold of the barn. At mid-morning, Emmett came back alone on foot with half his face white with cold. She had him inside and sitting before he finished his second sentence. The trail gave way on the upper section. He said, "Ice under the snow." Orrin's horse went down. "Orrin is all right. Leg bruised but not broken. But we had to pull back. Most of us made it to Calloway's line shack about a mile east." He stopped, swallowed. "Mr. Hargrove did not make it to the shack." The room went very still. "He is alive," Emmett said quickly. He got turned around in the whiteout and his horse went down on the ice and threw him. "He is in a ravine on the north side of the trail. There is an overhang keeping the worst of the snow off. Orrin saw it happen and Orrin stayed with him." He looked at her. "But he is hurt. His knee, we think. Maybe ribs. He cannot walk out and we cannot get a horse through on that section of the trail. The ice is too bad after the creek crossing. What do you need?" "We need someone to get word to the Vane Ranch and have Fletcher send men up the eastern approach. Their lower trail stays off the worst of the ridge ice. But the road to the Vane place goes past the creek, and in this weather," she was already doing the arithmetic. "How long has he been in the ravine since before dawn?" 4 hours, maybe 5. 4 hours. Injured, in a ravine in an April blizzard in Montana Territory. She did not let the number settle into her chest the way it wanted to. She put it where she put things that required action rather than feeling, and she stood up. "Stay here," she told Emmett. "Get warm. Tell Hobie to keep you warm." She went to the barn. Hellfire heard her coming across the yard from 30 feet out. She knew because his head came up and his ears went forward in the way that was hers specifically. She unlatched the gate and went in, and he came to her directly. No spiral, no testing. He walked straight across the corral and stood in front of her, and she put both hands on his face and looked at him. She had not rehearsed what she was going to say. She said it the way it came. "I need to ask you something," she said. "Not tell you. Ask." The wind hit the barn wall with a sound like something breaking. Hellfire did not flinch. He had not flinched at wind in 3 weeks. "I know what it is to carry more weight than people think a body can bear," she said. "You know it too. We have been carrying it our whole lives, and we are still here." She pressed her forehead very gently against the side of his face. "I need you to carry me tonight, just tonight, through whatever the eastern road looks like in this wind and this ice. through the distance between here and where Colt Hargrove is lying in a ravine, because he trusted a trail in a blizzard and the trail gave way. She stepped back and looked at him. "I am not taking anything from you," she said. "I am asking." Hellfire stood absolutely still. Then he shifted his weight forward. Not a kneel, not the full lowering of a horse responding to a trained command, but a tilting, a deliberate forward drop of his front end, just enough, an offering, his way of saying, "I heard you," his way of saying, "I choose this." Her throat closed completely. She went for a saddle because this was not a corral, and what she was asking him was not a circle in the yard, and she would not risk either of them for the sake of sentiment. She saddled him with her hands shaking inside her gloves, not from cold, but from something else. And she mounted, and she felt him hold her weight, the full weight of her, a weight the world had always called too much. And she felt him hold it without flinching, without resentment, the way he had learned to hold it, by choice. And she said thank you so quietly that it was almost not words at all. They went out into the storm. The cold on horseback in a blizzard was a different creature than the cold on foot. It found every opening in her coat and the space between her collar and her hat, and it went into those places and sat there. She focused on Hellfire under her, the heat of him rising through the saddle, the movement of him, steady and deliberate, carrying her the way he had learned to carry her, without flinching, the way she had learned to carry herself through every room that had not been built for her. The road to the Vane Ranch ran south before it curved east, and the lower approach kept them off the worst of the ridge ice. When the wind came in sideways at the curve, she lost visibility entirely for 30 seconds. She bent low and pressed her face against Hellfire's neck. "You know where the ground is," she said. "I trust you." She felt him lean into the wind and keep moving. The Vane Ranch house had light in every window when it came into view, and the light was the finest thing she had seen since she arrived in Montana. She was off the horse and at the door before the thought finished forming. When Dorothea Vane opened it and saw her standing there covered in snow with a black horse at her back, she did not ask a single question. She turned her head and called Fletcher's name in a voice that moved through the house like a command. "Colt is on the North Ridge, Nora said, East Ravine, halfway up the trail. He is with Orrin Dace, injured, cannot walk out. He needs men and a sled and horses that know the eastern approach." Fletcher appeared from the back hallway, already pulling on his coat. "How long has he been there?" Dorothea asked. 5 hours, maybe more." Dorothea turned. "Fletcher," she said. 4 men. The sled. The 2 grays. They know that trail in the dark." She turned back to Nora. "You are coming back with us." "Yes," Nora said. Dorothea looked at Hellfire, who was standing in the howling dark with his head up and his eyes clear and his breathing steady, as if the storm were simply weather and weather was simply a thing that happened. "That horse," Dorothea said carefully. "Is that the one that—" "Yes," Nora said. "That horse." Dorothea looked at her. Then she said, "Go bring your husband home." They found Colt in the ravine with Orrin crouched beside him, and both of them gray with cold. Colt was conscious. That was the first thing. Conscious and shaking and angry at himself in the way of a man who takes pride in his own competence and has been demonstrably defeated by a patch of ice on a trail he has ridden 100 times. "You were supposed to stay at the ranch," he said, when he heard her voice. "I was," she said. She knelt beside him in the snow and put her hands on his face, the way she had learned to assess a person quickly. Color, responsiveness, the stillness of someone who is managing pain. His color was poor, but not catastrophic. His breathing told her what she needed to know about the ribs. The knee she could see from where she knelt. "Can you feel your feet?" she asked. "Yes." Move them. A pause. Then, yes. Good. She sat back on her heels. Fletcher Vane's sled is 20 feet above us. We are going to get you onto it and take you home. The cattle can wait until morning, she said. You cannot. He looked at her in the way he had been looking at her since January, with the expression of a man who started out thinking he knew what he needed and discovered somewhere along the way that he had needed something entirely different, and that the difference was the whole point. I just need to say, he started. Say it by the fire, she said, where I can hear you over the wind. She put her hand on the side of his face. We are both going to be there. I am promising you that. He closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them. How did you get here? She looked up, just briefly, to where Hellfire stood at the lip of the ravine with one of the Vane hands holding his reins, with the careful looseness of someone who had been told very little and had figured out the rest on his own. I asked. She said, and he said yes. Getting Colt up the ravine wall and onto the sled was the work of 4 men and 15 minutes and a great deal of careful maneuvering that she directed and did not participate in because she had learned which jobs were hers and which were not. She rode back on Hellfire beside the sled, close enough to see Colt's face in the lantern light that Fletcher held from the front bench. He looked at her the whole way home. The ranch house was warm and full of people when they arrived. Hobie had done what Hobie did when he was frightened, which was to cook until the fear ran out of room. The kitchen smelled of it. Emmett was upright and had color back. Theron Quill and the other hands who had sheltered at the line shack had found their way in by a different route and were in the yard when the sled came through the gate. She worked on Colt's knee for 2 hours at the kitchen table with the lamp pulled close and the rest of the house quiet around them. It was bad, but not permanently bad. The kind of injury that healed with rest and the refusal to be reckless again too soon. She told him that in the tone she used for things that were serious. He listened the way he listened to serious things, completely and without argument. The ribs were cracked. She had dealt with worse. She told him that too. By midnight, the storm was easing. By 3 a.m, the ranch was quiet. Most of the hands had gone to the bunkhouse. Hobie had been persuaded to sleep. Emmett had fallen asleep at the kitchen table again, and she had put a blanket over him and left him there. She was sitting beside Colt in the lamplight when he said, "He is not going to come back." "Calvin," she said. "He does not have the money for a real legal fight," she said. He knew that when he got on the stagecoach in Billings. He was hoping the presence of him would do what the letters could not. And if he finds the money somewhere, then Richard Bain earns his fee, she said, and we go on with our lives in the meantime. He looked at her for a long time. Then he said, "Are you afraid of anything?" She thought about it honestly. "Yes," she said. "I was afraid when I got on the stagecoach in Columbus. I was afraid every morning I stood at the fence. I was afraid when I went through that gate the first time and every time after." She met his eyes across the lamplight. "I have been afraid of most of the things that turned out to matter. But being afraid and being stopped are not the same thing. I stopped confusing them a long time ago." He reached out and took her hand, both of her hands, held them with the same deliberate steadiness with which he held everything. And she held his back. Outside in the quiet after the storm, Hellfire stood at the near fence line, not pacing, not braced, standing with his head up and his ears forward and his whole body at rest, the way an animal stands when it has finally decided that the place it occupies is safe. Spring came to Millhaven the way it comes to that part of Montana, not gradually but suddenly, the way hard things end, overnight and definitive. The snow gave up without ceremony. The mud came. The cattle moved back to the north pasture without incident. The mornings came earlier, and the light in them was different from winter light, warmer and less certain of itself, which she found she preferred. Colt's knee healed slowly. She bullied him into rest, and he submitted to being bullied with the grace of a man who has decided to trust the person doing the bullying. By April, he was walking without a limp. By May, he was riding. The day he rode beside her across the north pasture, the first real ride since the storm, both of them on horseback in the May sunshine, with the mountains enormous and still white at the peaks above them, she thought about Ohio, about the kitchen table and the letter she had read 3 times, about everything she had been afraid she was and everything she had been told she was, and the long distance between those 2 things and this. Hellfire moved beneath her with the easy rolling stride of an animal that has decided cooperation is preferable to conflict and has made that decision so completely that it no longer requires any daily renegotiation. He did not spook at the meadowlarks coming up from the grass. He did not brace at the wind coming off the ridge. He simply moved, and she moved with him, and the ground passed under them, the way good ground does when you are no longer fighting it. "You are thinking," Colt said, riding beside her. "I always am. What about—" She looked at the mountains. She looked at the sky. She felt the sun on her face and the horse under her and the solid, specific reality of a life that had been built out of the things she had refused to give up. Her stubbornness, her patience, her willingness to stand still in a road when everything in her had said to run, about how wrong they were. She said, "Everyone who said I was too much." Colt looked at her. "Every last one of them," she said. "They were wrong." He nodded once, slow and certain, the nod of a man who does not say things he does not mean and has not said a single thing to her in 4 months that he did not mean entirely. She turned her face back to the mountains and she rode. That spring and every spring after, the people of Millhaven told the story differently than they had told it in January. Not the story of the large woman who had arrived on the stagecoach to be laughed at. The story of the woman who had stood in the road when no one else did, who had walked into a corral that men would not enter, who had ridden a horse that could not be ridden, through a blizzard that stopped everything else, to bring one good man home from a ravine on a ridge in the dark. They had called her too much, too large for a saddle, too soft for a frontier, too big for a life that was supposed to be built small and quiet and grateful. But it was that very fullness of her, of body, of mercy, of stubbornness, of a heart that had been broken open and had refused to learn smallness from the breaking, that had outlasted every winter thrown against it, that had built something worth saving, that had ridden into the storm when the storm was real and the road was ice, and the only thing standing between one good man and the cold was one strong woman who had never, not once, made herself less than she was. Billy Crane came to the corral on a Tuesday morning in late April. He stood at the fence with his hat in his hands, and he waited until she came to him because he had learned, in the roundabout way that 12-year-old boys learn things they will carry the rest of their lives. That waiting was the right approach with both horses and with women who had earned the right to be approached on their own terms. "I was wondering," he said, "if you might show me sometime how you stand at the fence." She looked at him for a moment. He had grown 2 inches since January. His voice was beginning to do the uncertain thing that boys' voices do before they settle into what they will become. "Before I can show you anything," she said, "you need to learn one thing first." "What is that?" She turned back to the fence, to Hellfire, who had come to the near rail at the sound of her footsteps and was standing there with his ears forward in the posture that was hers alone. "You need to learn how to stand still," she said. "Most people never do. They think stillness is the same as doing nothing. It is not. It is the hardest work there is." Billy Crane was quiet for a moment. Then he came to stand beside her at the fence, not too close, at the respectful distance of someone who understands that some spaces are earned, and this one had been earned by someone else first. They stood in the May morning, the woman and the boy and the horse that had been broken and had decided to become something else instead. The mountains were behind them. The sky above was the pale blue of a Montana spring morning, thin and clear and very wide. Billy Crane did not speak, and she did not prompt him. He was standing still for perhaps the first time in his life and discovering that it was not nothing. That stillness had a weight to it, that what you could see from inside it was different from what you could see when you were moving. She watched Hellfire's ear turn toward the boy. Slow, considering. She thought about January, about a street full of laughter and a horse no one could stop, and a woman who had planted her feet in the mud and refused to be less than she was. She thought about what that afternoon had cost and what it had built, and how the two things were not separate at all, but the same thing seen from different ends of time. That is how it starts, she said quietly. Not with anything you do, just with being willing to stay. Hellfire took one step toward the fence, one step, unhurried, of his own will, toward a boy who had once laughed at the woman now standing beside him, and had been finding his way back from that moment ever since. Billy Crane held very still, and in the May morning, with the mountains rising white above them and the whole long season ahead, that was enough.